During the winter I spent a lot of time around Troublesome Reach and Icon Cliff. The more I got to know it, the more I came to love it. I came to recognise some of the individuals at the livery stables beside the river. The same people would come out and pick up the same horses every day. One little sod of a pony spent all day bullying and pestering the other horses. As well as the seal who was always there, I got to know one of the divers that worked the 6-foot contour just along the edge of the channel, but only on the flood tide.
Wow, you don't spend long on the surface, do you? It's working that kind of 6 foot, just working along the edge.
No idea where it worked during the ebb. I looked for it, never found it. Probably went somewhere even the slug couldn't reach. One dead calm day the reflections were so perfect it was sometimes hard to tell where the sky ended and the water began. And on another occasion the incoming tide brought a massive jellyfish swarm pulsing languorously up past the boat.
Oh, there's the ice, by the way. It's not very warm.
Quiet, crisp, cold, contemplative days. I and the slug drifted up and down with the current, delighting in the way the riverbed geography comes and goes with the rise and fall of the water.
This is a Tuesday morning in March, at the top of the Alde. I'm just following the withies up with the tide. There are a few mud islands which are just starting to disappear. This little one is gone here. There's a big mud island here though. It's got water on both sides of it at the moment. This one's just going. It's coming to the tide now, look. Wow, that's a big scar.
I came to know the curves and shapes of Troublesome Reach. Not as well as the locals, certainly not as intimately as the seal, but enough to stop us leaving ugly keel scars on the glistening perfection of the mud.
This is a brilliantly crazy bit of river. And there's the next red marker. So that's the channel I'm going to be going along in a second. There's this massive curve. Isn't that brilliant? Just drifting with the tide up here and there's no wind at all, which is lovely.
Hardly ever saw any other boats. Although occasionally one of the barge owners would come sputt-puttering up the river. And one great day he came out to play. Barges need no wharf for unloading. Float them over some hard standing, wait for the tide to go and back the carts right up alongside. The sprit doubles as a crane and is a wonderfully efficient way of spreading the almost square sail to the wind. It's been cut so that whichever side of the sprit it lies, you still get those efficient aerofoil shapes so necessary for making progress upwind. One big baggy foil on starboard and a pair of pretty well shaped foils on port. They look like a couple of perfect high peaked jibs. I'm told that barges are often closer winded on port than on starboard. Genius. The two barges moored at Troublesome Reach are half size, but to watch the owners working their small ships, single-handed with everything flying, well, it's a bit of a privilege. At high tide, the birds, deprived of their mud, cluster in large groups on the few bits of dry land. Occasionally the gulls will take to the air in search of a thermal and spend an hour or more just riding it while waiting for the tide to go back down. I went all the way up to Snape a couple of times. The first trip was on the last 2 hours of a spring tide. Plenty of water all the way, provided you follow the withies. I also drifted through a seawall, deliberately I might add, and over what was once productive agricultural land.
Now then, pre-1950-53, whenever the floods were, this was land. And there's a gap here, and there's a gap on the other side. Somewhere, I seem to remember seeing. My guess is that if I chose the right tide, I could sail through there. Oh, hello, Crow. Here we go. The boat's going through onto what was land. There we go, across the seawall. Cool.
But it was a grey old day. Horrible, horrible light. If you really want to see the top of the Alde at its best, then you need to be bumping along the bottom with the incoming tide, but you do need a shallow draft boat like the Slug. And it also helps if it's a nice day and the weather is being kind.
Over in the distance there's a field that's covered in polythene, and every now and again it catches me out. I think, oh, I didn't realise there was a bit of water there. There's the mess I made when I went aground yesterday. I'm a bad person. And here is one of the biggest withies I've ever seen. Not very exciting, I know, but...
For the most part, it's easy to guess the mind of the man who placed the withies, especially those marked port and starboard. But occasionally, a bit of guesswork is required. It's not until you take a journey to the top of some of these sinuous navigations that you realise what great sailors the old barge captains must have been. To get a 90-foot Thames barge all the way to the top of this winding river must have been a frustrating business. Sure, there's a tide, but the river twists and turns so often that at some stage it's inevitable that the wind will come right on the nose. The crews would often have to pole their almost 100-ton vessels along to get them around the bends. And a big, well-laden barge drawing up to 4 foot would have had a much smaller tide window than I did with the Slug. And sure enough, even for me, the last 200 yards were completed with the help of the beast, but only going at enough revs to give me some steerage around the bends. East Anglia has long been the breadbasket of England. You can't argue with a mere 24 inches of rain when it comes to growing good grain. So infrastructure for moving large quantities of the stuff around has always been important. Around the coast you can find plenty of maltings, such as the one at Snape. The English have always been keen on alcohol, not me of course, and beer in particular. But in order to turn grain into beer, it needs to be malted, which is a labour and energy intensive process. The grain, usually barley, has to be brought to the maltings where it's spread out on massive wooden floors and wetted down so that it starts to germinate. The enzymes kick into gear and start to turn the carbohydrate in grain into sugar. But the process needs to be brought rapidly to a halt. Fires were lit under the malting floor and the grain had to be turned and turned until it was dry and crispy, sweaty, back-breaking work for the labourers. Some of it would be dried so fast that it became almost toasted, producing a much darker beer. The malt would then be bagged up again, loaded onto barges and sent to the breweries, many of them on the outskirts of London. It makes more sense to move the light malt around rather than the barrels of beer, which are heavy, cumbersome and mostly water. A big maltings like the one at Snape would have provided employment for hundreds of men working on the wharf, on the malting floors and stoking the furnaces. But Snape is now frequented by middle-aged, middle-class, white-haired people like me. They come for afternoon tea, talks about birds and a stroll around the sculpture park. I wasn't going to say anything about what I thought about these sculptures set in a landscape, but there I was yakking away to myself on the soundtrack.
In loving memory of those yet to be born. Well, just kids could have fun on there. By Barbara Hepworth, it's called The Family of Man, from 9 Figures on a Hill. No, I think it's like my boat. There's no angle from which it looks good. It's Percival, Sarah Lucas, bronze polished brass concrete paint horse. Oh dear, you're not allowed to go anywhere near him, bugger. I wonder why he's carrying 2 marrows. Why couldn't they be sacks of grain? I like horses, but I'm not sure I like this any more than the other ones. Looks like something from Disney World.
In my considered opinion, no natural view has ever been enhanced by the addition of a sculpture, unless it's a Goldsworthy. Some of the people stay for the evening when they get a big dollop of culture, often in the form of a Benjamin Britten opera. He is Suffolk's favourite artistic son. His operas are very well respected. But for my taste, his librettos are wall-to-wall gloom, full of foreboding and include frequent drownings. Come to think of it, I can't hum a single tune of his either, but the Suffolk cognoscenti are very proud of him, and who am I to gainsay them? The 3 rivers of the Alde, Orr and Buckley have been wonderful places to explore. This has been my best winter afloat ever. The sailing, the scenery, the history, the light and the wildlife have been absolutely brilliant. Goslings have started to appear, so spring is on its way. Time to head off around the corner towards Southwold and then onwards to the Broads and North Norfolk.